Hello, and welcome to this panel discussion sponsored by the Student Council of McCormick Theological Seminary. I am Steed Davidson, the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty at McCormick Theological Seminary. I also teach in the field of Hebrew Bible Old Testament studies. Our panel discussion today centers on the intersection of womanist studies and queer thought. And with us are two profoundly intelligent women who can lead our conversations on this issue. So let me introduce you to them. First, Dr. Pamela Lightsey. She is the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean at the Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago, one of my colleagues in many different ways. We in this struggle for academic administration. But Dr. Lightsey also is a womanist theologian and has spent a number of her years and her career writing from that perspective and indeed looking at the issue of queer thought. Dr. Lightsey, like myself, is an elder in the United Methodist Church, and I am happy to have her in our midst as a longtime resident of the city of Chicago and someone familiar with several of the issues that we will be dealing with today. Alongside of her is my colleague, Dr. Stephanie Crumpton, who is the Associate Professor of Practical Theology here at McCormick Theological Seminary. Dr. Crumpton is a long time resident of the city of Chicago. In fact, was born in these precincts and in these areas. And her work, again, is centered in womanist thought and practical theology with emphasis on pastoral care and activist work. Now, both of these two distinguished panelists are persons whose heart, practice, work, and scholarship is centered in the lives of the community, and the lives of community and the struggle to make the lives of Black people in general and all people who face oppression even more tolerable. And so the intersection of womanist thinking and queer thought is a space that both of them can occupy with a great deal of integrity and a great deal of intelligence. I am happy that they both consented to this invitation, and I'm happy that we get to sit at their feet today. Ladies, thank you and welcome. So here's how we will proceed today. I'm going to invite each of our panelists to offer a presentation of their work for as long as they would, and able to do so. And I'm going to ask them a particular question. And then we'll take questions from you, the audience. So please feel free to start to think about those questions. But two of the guiding thoughts that we are looking at today comes from this notion that some scholars have argued that Blackness is queer. And so how do you see womanism being queer? And secondly, how do queerness and womanism challenge ideas of respectability politics and the concepts of holiness and piety in the church? But we also have this other question to think about. How are womanist theologies challenged by queer thought? And how do womanist theologies expand the range of queer thought? There are several questions, and perhaps they're all in the same range. But I'm going to invite first Dr. Lightsey to give us her initial thoughts on any or all of these questions that I've just put forward there. And then afterwards, I'll invite Dr. Crumpton. So Dr. Lightsey.
Well, I'm very happy to be with you all today. I thank you for the invitation. Can you hear me? It's very good to see you all. And the questions are great questions. I'm very happy for the questions. So let me begin in this way. To respond to the question about Blackness, the argument that Blackness is queer, and how womanism itself might be, how I might see womanism as being queer. So the uninterrogated response to this question about womanism and queer as an identity, that is the beingness of queer, would resource the area of Alice Walker's 4-part definition, where she describes a womanist as a woman who loves other women sexually and or non-sexually. Now, I don't want to go too much into the definition because I believe that my colleague, Dr. Crumpton, will have more to say on that matter. Instead, to the extent that Blackness is being argued as a kind of queerness, one does so because to be queer, at least here in America, has for quite some time come with a sense of dangerous, risque, and yes, even taboo difference. One also makes this argument as a way of arguing against the so-called choice and lifestyle propositions that plague the LGBTQ community. That is to say that Blackness must always be in solidarity with queerness because the beingness, the essential condition of the queer body is, though differently manifested, similarly an irresistible matter. Womanism, to the extent that it describes Black women, is also, I believe, a kind of irresistible matter. One does not opt out of, is what I'm trying to say. One does not opt out of being a Black woman, despite how some have tried. One does not opt into being, one does not opt into being a Black woman. And here I'm thinking, of course, of Rachel Dolezal. But at this level, I'm admittedly making a rather weak case for womanism as a methodology. And I want to highlight that as a methodology, one is right there making a weak case. It provokes the oft asked questions, must I be a woman to be a womanist? So one has only to look at feminism to see that a similar question has been answered decades ago, because millions of men now identify as feminists. Whether or not they live up to the principles is another matter. The second question being, must I be a Black woman to be a womanist? To which one might respond, which one might do well to be in conversation with Victor Anderson's seminal work, which is Beyond Ontological Blackness. In each case, one is always or ever problematizing a kind of essentialism that is always in place when one takes on constructed categories rather than the more interesting presuppositions that come forth when we are forced to deal with the real effects of what has been constructed. Black being a racial identity and woman being a gender expression. And I want to underscore this, I am not in the camp of embracing a beingness to any and everyone when it comes to historically oppressed groups, because to be Black, to be woman, to be queer is a dangerous embodiment. Okay? Simply because one has, I'll give an example, simply because one has a foot fetish does not make one queer when it comes to the embodiment of oppressed LGBTQ plus people. You might simply be a really good old toe sucker, you know, who gets off on such things. But that does not mean that one embodies, one can then make the case that one embodies in such a way the lives of oppressed people. And as the young people would say, and that's how Mary had a little laugh, there are indeed womanists like myself who are queer, to the extent that one might regard womanism as a methodology, as queer, is because it takes at its points of departure things which from its origination to now, that is Occidental or Western theology, has not taken as critically important. And that would be the matters of racism, the narratives of Black women as resources, and the particular lives of Black lesbians, bisexuals, queer and transgender women, as well as gender non-conforming persons. Now I say this with the caveat that not all womanist scholars do the work that frames these perspectives. So I kind of want to hold that out there. To the second question, the question that had to do with queerness and womanism, challenging ideas of respectability politics and the concepts of holiness and piety in the church. So I gave that, you know, I kind of gave that question some thought. I want to enter that question in perhaps in a strange way for some, but I want to try to answer that question by beginning with a quote that I hope will make sense as I begin to connect the dots. So here is the quote. The quote is from Toni Morrison, and it's a quote that I love and that I've been using lately because it so resonates with me. Toni Morrison said this. Toni Morrison said, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says that you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdom, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be, Morrison said, one more thing. Let me put that up for you all to see that. Let me see, share my screen if I may. So I hope you all can see that. Okay. As an out queer womanist scholar, I have had the unique experience of responding time and time again to Black church devotees of respectability politics who felt that my very presence somehow tainted the race. And that if I would just straighten, no pun intended, that if I would somehow straighten myself up, given my already acquired credentials, that's 3 credentials, bachelor's, master's, PhD, that I would somehow be a credit to my race. Somehow they would not hesitate to show off to white people as an example. If I would just straighten myself up, they can kind of prop me up as a good example, as a credit to the race. Now, others have even invited me to leave my church and go somewhere with my own kind if I didn't like how I was being treated. Because after all, if you follow the logic, the way this queer and womanist scholar was being treated had everything to do with my behavior and not theirs. All of this is for me and others simply distraction, as Morrison would put it, trying to live up to someone else's concept of holiness and piety, that is devoutness, that is worthiness, as virtues. These things keep queer persons, keep womanists, keeps Black, brown, and Asian people from doing the work. As a queer womanist, it's important for me to remind folks that you will never be sinless. You will never have enough purity in your body to protect you from being attacked by a dedicated bigot. You will never be able to quote enough scriptures to prove your worth as a child of God. We as scholars will never be able to disabuse a dedicated homo, transphobic person that the way they have interpreted scripture is inaccurate. You can try it, but as Toni Morrison said, there will always be one more thing. So what is the work of queer and womanist scholars, given that we exist at a time when these politics and concepts are at work? A few things, and then I'll close. First, get as free as you can. Now, that may or may not mean coming out. Getting free will be one of the hardest but most satisfying things that you do as a queer person and as a scholar, whether you be free, whether you be queer or heterosexual or gender non-conforming. It is a liberating experience. It's a wonderful feeling to get free. Free to live your life without looking over your shoulder for fear that someone will out you. Free to write your book without feeling beholden to an institution or the language of whiteness or heteronormativity or ableism or classism. Second, help others get free. One of the most satisfying things for me to watch and to participate in during this pandemic is people with tech savvy helping the elders secure vaccination appointments, using what they know, their experience, to help others. As a womanist scholar, I try to do this by researching the lives of Black LGBTQ+ women in order to think theologically on the issues of our time that threaten the well-being of Black and queer people. I believe that my work as a womanist scholar and those who will join this endeavor is to counter the narrative that LGBTQ+ persons are sinful and going to hell. Simply because of the matter of their beingness, and that beingness particularly being queer and same gender loving. Instead, the work that I do is to make the case theologically using reason, tradition, experience, and scripture to show the LGBTQ+ community that they are beloved of God. Third, queer can engage the theological and the political. In fact, I would make the case that it is best when it does that and more. Case in point, during the most recent presidential election, I and a team of LGBTQ+ persons formed what is called the Black Political Collective. Our goal was to reach Black LGBTQ+ persons to encourage them to register to vote. The work, because of the pandemic, was solely virtual. During a 3-month period, we reached nearly 27,000 persons and were recognized by National PAC for our work. Sadly, one of our members, Monica Roberts, a phenomenal Black trans woman, dear friend of mine of several years, unexpectedly died just a few weeks shy of being able to cast her vote. In her hometown of Houston, Texas, the mayor proclaimed a day recognizing her vast achievement and her recognition. She was paid tribute by activists, by state and federal senators, and by members of the community. What a tribute. This, my friends, is an example of how one makes a difference rather than succumb to the distractions, especially those that come from the church. It instructs Blacks to that come from the church, and I'll end right there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lightsey, for setting the stage and setting the table and laying it all out for us with these very profound words. And your three-part prescription at the end was quite helpful, and we can come back to some of those as our conversations proceed. I now turn over to Dr. Stephanie Crumpton for her responses to the questions. And I want to let our participants know that we have a Q&A box where we'll receive the questions you will send to the panelists. So please go ahead, write your questions in the Q&A box. Dr. Crumpton.
Thank you so much, Dean Davidson, and thank you, Dr. Lightsey. I think I want to pick up on, there were several questions in there, and I want to pick up on one piece that helps us backtrack a little bit. So I'm actually going to start with the actual definition of womanism, right? We can't make any assumptions. I have learned not to make any assumptions about what people know and where people are entering the conversation. And so the first thing I want us to do is get clear that to be a womanist is not about a personality of the people you see on this screen or who you have encountered in various different lectures or conferences. To be a womanist is not about personality. To be a womanist is actually about the commitments. And the commitments are very much informed, right? And I like to go back to source material and see where we have now, where we are based on where we started. So Alice Walker in '83 actually wrote this piece it's from her book, In Search of Our Mother's Garden. It's at the very beginning of the book, and it is a 4-part definition that you see there, right? And people have snatched out and used different pieces of it, and it is actually that, I casually named that, but it's actually that act of snatching, right? From the definition that has in part led to some of the confusion about what it is to be and become and self-identify as a womanist in your everyday life. And also, particularly this conversation, in your scholarship and also in your practice and ministry on the ground, wherever you may find yourself called. Now, Alice Walker, who many people know her from a lot of her different works, but Alice Walker herself is a self-identified, sexually fluid pagan woman. She self-identifies herself as sexually fluid and clearly not Christian, all right? In '83, she published this piece, and actually this piece in conversation with another piece from '79, Things Coming Apart, actually are these pieces that help us identify that this is a statement from a woman about what it is to be and become a woman in community. And I name that explicitly because there are ways in which womanist, just the word itself, conjures all kinds of fear and anxiety that I'm going to address in just a little bit, right? But this is what she was talking about. And it wasn't to be a woman who hates men or who wants to be apart from men or the rest of the world, except in cases, not a separatist, here in line 2, not a separatist, except periodically for help. So built within this definition, right? There are 4 pieces to it. It talks about being responsible, in charge, and serious. A woman who loves women sexually and or non-sexually. And so that's another piece, right? She is a self-proclaimed pagan out lesbian woman. Now, when you look at when she initially articulated this in '83, this was about the same time right? That a lot of our Black women in religion and theology were getting doctorates, oftentimes in theology, theology, ethics, and Bible. And they were picking up, like Alice Walker's work was picking up and becoming a part of what we identified as crucial, critical language and literature. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this definition. I'm going to bring it a little bit forward for what it means and the challenges it means, that it creates for how we use it, how we engage it, and how at times we misappropriate it to the expense of the community. So here I've written a little piece, and it talks about Alice Walker's definition and how it encapsulated Black women's tendency to know and talk back to the social and political elements that compromise our existence, including those moments when those pernicious elements have and continue to show up in the intimate, communal, familial, and spiritual relationships that give our very lives meaning. Walker, when she wrote this, hadn't said anything that Black women hadn't already been living. But she did print it in a way that positioned Black women's ways of knowing, also identified as epistemology, but Black women's ways of knowing and agency, exercising agency, as fodder for deep and expansive intellectual work. The term and its conceptualization became foundational for Black women's scholarship across academic disciplines, including religion and theology. In 1985, ethicist Katie G. Cannon was the first Black religious scholar to formally present womanist theology as the foundation for thinking about God and the world from a Black woman's perspective. Cannon had come to that point in her intellectual activism along with her former classmates and contemporary colleagues in theological education, Jacqueline Grant and Dolores Williams. Cannon, Grant, and Williams are the foremothers of womanist religious and theological discourse. They held open the door and crafted canons that are rooted in and informed by Black girls' and women's lived experiences, analysis, and strategies for healing, resistance, and thriving. The foundation that these women laid based upon Alice Walker's writings carved out a formative space where Black women in religion and theology found themselves at the center, not on the margins, of the questions that we ask, the processes by which we seek answers, and declarations we make about what it means to breathe, think, feel, relate, and approach freedom and Black skin from our nuanced female-identified perspectives. As of 2021, Womanist theology approaches its fourth generation of scholars, professors, and practitioners who center Black girls' and women's lived experiences in their scholarship, community engagement, and everyday life. Now, particular to this conversation, this is a womanist discussion. And I want to focus on two of the four tenets. First, wanting to know more and in greater depth than is considered good for one. And secondarily, committed to survival and wholeness of entire people, male and female. White supremacy demands that Black girls and women keep our minds and mouths out of conversation about racism as a matrix of interlocking oppressions, and survival has at times required disavowal of our deep knowing that the pain and struggle that we experience in these bodies is specifically because these bodies are Black. We know that there is something at play in the world that is orchestrated and intentional, but because we have been taught what is good for keeping breath alive and moving in these bodies, we often deem it most important to keep our minds and mouth off the work of demystifying white supremacy for the sake of survival. But I am a womanist. Dr. Lightsey is a womanist. We are both willingly succumbing to Black girls and women's immediate need to know more and in greater depth than what's pre and proscribed as good for us, because we are committed to surviving and being whole in spite of. That Walker holds survival and wholeness in high esteem in her definition of womanist is instructive. Survive what? And furthermore, what parts of Black selves need to be mended back whole, and who and what and how and where and are we rent asunder again and again? That pain is deep, deep. Let me tell you something. When Black folks talk about something being deep, deep, we'd say the word deep 2 times in a row. We're trying to get you to pay attention to the thing that we said, but also the thing that sits up underneath it that keeps it in play. White supremacy is a deep, deep threat to Black survival. It is a web that gains its strength from the interconnecting nodes of sexism, homophobia, classism, ableism, and all the other cousins of oppression. and allows those oppressions to stretch out over Black communities, but more importantly, within them. Womanist deep, deep healing sets its mind and mouth towards sustaining Black bodies that experience the pain of racism, and deep, deep pain requires that deep, deep healing. This conversation about the intersection where queer and womanist work intersect prompts me to think long, hard, and deeply about marginalization within the Black margins that generate intra-group pain and suffering. This is about ignoring the shush to keep quiet about in-group disparity, which looks like the reluctance to harvest Black political power for Black bodies that are female identified, LGBTQI, non-binary, or differently abled, with an energy that is on par with the power and energy from the community that is generally reserved for Black bodies that are male, cisgendered, and heterosexual. This is what it means to seek the wholeness of an entire people, as Walker instructs us. Wholeness as in not just one part of our Black embodied experience, but seeking wholeness from every oppression for every Black body. I also have here this piece here from Monica Coleman, Ain't I a Womanist Too? Third Wave Womanist Religious Thought, which is an extension of an article where she first asked the question, must I be a womanist? When she raised that question during a roundtable conversation at the American Academy of Religion, she was actually juxtaposing the politics of Black feminists that had gone further around sexuality, had gone further in their discourse and scholarship and practice also around interreligious work, around non-Christian concepts and constructs to examine what it is to live and be Black and female. And so what she did, and I'm gonna tell you the truth, this has been a part of the history and the heritage of womanist work, right? That there was a huge piece around people jumped on her. Womanists for a good while, some of the earlier generation womanists jumped on her because she had dared to raise the question about how far the womanist work had not gone to address our queer sisters, our LGBTQ community, right? And persons who are Black, who are family, but because they are not Christian, are not identified and received and advocated on behalf of because they are not Black and Christian, right? And so I bring to you also the awareness that in as much as womanist work is committed to peeling back white supremacy, you cannot peel back white supremacy without also taking up its cousins that show up primarily around anti-LGBTQI sentiment, right? And so if we're going to be womanists, and this is part of the charge, right? And so I appreciate the way that the question was initially posed. This was part of the charge. What does womanist work have to say to queer life, and what does queer life have and scholarship have to say to womanist work? I think there's a moment in which we have to grapple with Black feminists who are not necessarily womanists, and their pieces around sexuality and their politics around a deep disengagement, a deep dive into becoming anti-patriarchal, right? Against heteropatriarchal work becomes a significant resource for straight womanists who oftentimes will take up that work, but sometimes would not acknowledge that lesbian women and queer authors were the primary resources that helped them form the critique. So there's a way in which there's a level of healing, ongoing healing and advances in scholarship that is taking place right now in the womanist camp that kind of complexifies the initial question that you posed to us, Dr. Davidson, right? Because there's a way in which womanist work is still in its process of detangling itself from heteropatriarchy. And this is kind of the work that is happening right now. So when we talk about righteousness and purity and things about bodies and things like that in the church space, part of that is around what has white supremacy done to us in church spaces and how has it impacted our relationship. And there are ways in which we have to also then say, how have we internalized that, that ethic of hierarchy, that ethic, that scarcity commitment, and then vented it towards who can be some of the most vulnerable within Black circles who are members of the LGBTQI community, in particular trans women, right? So there's some work that is that is ongoing and that continues to need to be done in-house as we examine the question and the possibility of the question about what happens in the conversation between womanist and queer, queer and womanist. And the way that the question is set up also kind of suggests that to be womanist is to not be queer, right? And that's a challenge, right, in and of itself, because then it echoes, right, what happened when Christian Black women picked up Alice Walker's work without picking up Alice Walker's body. Okay, so I think that's a good place for me to kind of stop and for us to enter into further conversation. I hope that was clear, but I'm really excited about where we can go from here.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Crumpton, and thanks to both of you for these very provocative opening statements. I want us to spend a little bit of time and talking to both of you to talk to one another. And my first sort of invitation is to both of you to see if there were comments that you heard from your colleague that you want to engage for us just to press a little bit more on. Oh, you know, to advance in some ways. So without me imposing a question on you, I mean, I want to invite both of you just to talk to each other for a bit.
I do have a question because I'm working with this myself. Dr. Lightsey, can you talk about queer as noun, adjective, and verb?
Yes, I can. So as noun, queer has been both a pejorative term to describe a group of persons that straight or heterosexual persons saw as less than. And it was very, very ugly. It has a painful history in that sense. Also as noun, queer has been embraced, and I try to be really real, has been embraced in a subversive kind of way, much like the way that Black people have gone back and grabbed the term nigger, and instead said nigga, you know, and have turned it on its head. And in that way, it becomes also political. You know, because that's a political term. That's a noun in that sense. It's an umbrella term to include lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. So in that's the noun part of it. As a verb, one thinks of queering. You know, queer, one queers something. So when I think of the Godhead, it's very easy for me to queer the Godhead. Because I mean, or to queer the very notion of God, God's self, because God is that mysterium, you know. And to queer something means to turn it upside down, to problematize it. So that's verbing it. What was the other one that you asked?
I think noun and adjective, but I think you got it primarily. Yeah.
Yeah, what you were getting at. So I think your question really evokes for me a way of talking about something that's so expansive that it would take, I mean, we could not in one setting just really satiate one's curiosity about queer as a noun, as a verb, as a word, as a being. That would be very difficult to do in one setting. And I think that's only right, because it's very hard for me to describe what it means to be human, you know, in one setting. To be human is political. It's a political action in and of itself, especially these days. To be Black is to be political sometimes too. So I hope that addresses that. May I ask you? I really love the way you unpacked some of the challenges with the way that the very term womanist has been snatched up, so to say, and dispositioned from Alice Walker as a person who reminded us, because she didn't coin the term womanism. Okay. Womanism is an old term in Black folk language, but the way people have dispositioned her from how she used that term, and I really appreciated that, and I really appreciated how you reminded us of the history and the challenges that womanists themselves have had with embracing queer persons like myself. How would you describe where we are in womanist studies today when it comes to womanist and queer works and queer persons? You think we've come, how far have we come? I you know.
Yeah, I don't know that I have like a yardstick.
Yeah.
But I would say that we are not, let me just name, I'm really grateful for Monica Coleman's work. And she's representative of that impulse to push against that, right? Mm-hmm. So Monica's work, I think that had to have been, like 2004 or 5, somewhere like right in there, where she initially started that, or voiced, which was the only one feeling it and experiencing. She voiced that conversation. So I would say that we are on a continuum towards being in these bodies and the diversity of these bodies now, and writing about it. Now, I think it's really important that you ask me in terms of the scholarship, right? And also then what does it mean to live and be? Because there's oftentimes there is a bridge that needs construction and tending between the scholarship and the life in the pews and the wider community. And so I would say that in the scholarship we're doing, it continues to grow. There's much more space. You got folks like Deborah Mubashir Masjid Mubashir, who is a Muslim womanist, right? You've got womanists who are interreligious, non-Christian across it, who are being fought. The reception and respect for their work is much better, right? There continues to need to be a movement around that. When I think about what the work, what it looks like in terms of how our work is translating into the congregation and the pews, there's still work to do right there, because there's a way in which we have to acknowledge, right, that we have had the opportunity to go to seminary and to do this kind of deep thinking, and I'm not saying that they're not doing deep thinking in the pews, but what we do have is the safety of trying out ideas in the classroom that in a lower risk environment than trying out that kind of liberation in the pews. Right? There are ways in which it is very risky to try to push against the expectations around sexuality, the expectations around being falling in line with heteropatriarchy, all of those. It's much easier because we have a community to work it out in the classroom, in the seminary classroom. But when it comes to the pews, there are congregations that are creating and cultivating and nourishing that kind of conversation, that kind of wholeness. But when I look at the scale of African-American congregations, because that is my community, there is much room, much work to go, we got a ways to go when it comes to the pews. Now, I do want to highlight one other community, right, of spiritual people who might have been raised in the church but ain't in the church. And that's where you look at folks who will say, I'm spiritual but non-religious, or you see Black activists who self-identify as queer or queer aligned or queer in solidarity with queer folk. There is where some freedom is happening on the ground, right? These are folks who were raised in the church or had Christian parents.
Absolutely.
And so they didn't, just because they walked out of those walls didn't mean that they walked away from the binding spirituality and the binding early Jesus still with them, but they walked because they weren't safe in the congregation. But interestingly, they are reading folks, like they're reading the Black feminists, they're reading the Black womanists, they're reading Black theology. They are living. And quite honestly, for folks like me and you, they become the sources for our scholarship, right? And so I think that when we think about where we are in womanist work, I would say there's definitely movement around our scholarship within the womanist world, womanist relationships, right? I think there's definitely movement is definitely growing and continues to grow. when it comes to the congregation, we got a ways to go, because that heteropatriarchy with that Christian nationalism on top of some racism and classism got folks bound up around bodies and sexuality across the board, but in particularly dangerous ways.
Yeah.
If you're members of the LGBTQI, but in the street, you see.
Yeah, yeah.
These folks are having like Black Joy Sunday, right?
Trust me, I hear you. I've been
in the park, right? You know, and that just free, you know, don't let it be a house, you know, house music set. Somehow the house music set, right, done went up in worship, right? These are people, we're in the streets, right? So allyship and solidarity looks like, in some ways, the beloved community we're circling for, but can't get it inside the four walls, because the four walls can't hold it. It's not, there are not enough. I shouldn't say that as a blanket statement. There are not enough spaces. There are not enough four wall spaces that can hold that fullness. That's what
you reminded me of an experience I had in Ferguson. You know, I spent a long time, I have so many deep memories and friends from that work. But we were in front of the police station one night. And this Black guy, he was in the midst, and, you know, he got a little lippy, you know, he got excited and overzealous, and he felt like he had him stage, you know, and he just went, he went over. And when at the point at which he got homophobic, you should have seen the community say, "Oh no, we're not having that tonight." They went in on him, and it was such a blessed thing to see. Yeah, they were clear. We're not having that not in this community.
We already
not when we tried to get free. No, sir. No, sir. It was a beautiful thing to witness. It blessed my soul, you know. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that your words remind me of. May I just mention someone's name when you spoke about Monica Coleman? This is someone whose work predates Monica Coleman's work. And I don't think we say enough about her. And I want to remind people, Renee Hill suffered trying to do this work. Was attacked tremendously trying to do this work. And I think her name needs to be lifted up in these spaces as often as we can, because that sister got free and tried to help us get free, particularly in womanist circles, okay? And was not treated well by some. So I just want to remind folk of that and just kind of lift that up.
Thank you. And I also want to offer, thank you for saying that, because I'm hoping that people are noticing the modeling that's happening between Dr. Lightsey and I, Dr. Lightsey is in a generation ahead of me, right? So there are things that she knows, that there are stories, narratives, experiences that I'm not privy to, right? And I think also it's important that in as much as I'm naming that there was a challenge, right, in which first and second generation womanists snatched up Alice Walker's definition without taking her embodiment and bringing her the freedom of her embodiment too. There are also reasons why they didn't. There are also legitimate reasons why, as scholars, as first generation Black women scholars, there were at a time, and I say this with grace and accountability. I think we can't do revisionist history, and we also don't need to throw people under the bus. They were at a time and space where they had to pick one, where they had to choose. They felt they really only had one opportunity to get in the door and create a ruckus and deconstruct some things. And I think that there was a legitimate fear why they didn't bring what should have been, or what could have been considered equally pressing concerns to the forefront, right? And I think it speaks to, perhaps, I wasn't there, I'm not a first generation. The freedom I have now to speak is because they made the way, right? That there's a lot at stake when you open your mouth.
Yeah,
right? Yes. And I don't make an excuse for them, but I don't want it to seem that I'm making a uncompassionate critique of what of how they did what they did. And at the same time, they needed to do different. But I want to think about why. I don't know that it was solely a personal decision or an anti-LGBTQ decision. I don't think that it was intentionally.
For some, it was intentional.
Okay.
We need to be honest there. For some, it was intentional. For others, it was a matter of vocation and being able to continue your vocation without losing your career. You know, we're not that many years removed from the time where people could literally lose their jobs for doing the kinds of things I do now. I mean, and I'm not that far. In my denomination, I can still lose my credentials for this space that we're having right now. Somebody could write me up on charges and submit them and have me brought up, you know, before, in trial, you know, on trial. This is in my denomination. So it is not without its sacrifices. This is the thing that we're talking about. And when I talk about getting free, I don't mean this in a willy-nilly sort of way. To get free has always, always, always meant the possibility of deep sacrifices. And one of the reasons, and I write this in my book, why I didn't come out earlier than I came out is because I feared, because I was raising teenage children, and I feared being able to take care of my children and pay for, you know, all the expenses. I feared that. And I admitted that, and I admitted that that was, for me, the cowardly way to go. That was for me, you know, because I have the skill sets beyond my credentials to do something else. I could have done something else in retrospect to take care of me and my children, okay, while I got my credentials. I truly feared being ostracized in my denomination at the time. But look, years later, I didn't give a damn, and I was still ostracized in some corners of my denomination. So everything that I feared, they were going to do what they were going to do anyway, you know.
But is that cowardly, or is that like good common sense about the awareness of the force and power that you're dealing with? Is it both?
I mean, it's easy. It's easy now in the year of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ 2021 to say it wasn't cowardly. But at the time that I was writing, I really felt like it was the cowardly position. You understand what I'm saying? Okay. So this is what we're talking about: deconstruction and stepping into someone else's shoes back when. I felt horrible. I felt like a coward. I felt like, you know, you can do better. You know, and one at that time, yes, I could have. I had the wherewithal. But I could not see that until years later. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. I was trying to survive.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This is such a very rich and wonderful conversation. I'm just going to invite the participants again. If you have questions, please place them in the Q&A so that you could engage with our panelists that way and just continue this broad conversation that they are having, very meaningful, personal, generative conversation. So my one question I wanted to ask both of you, and you looked at it from different points of view. And Dr. Lightsey, you talked about you grounded a lot of your reflection in the notion of being, which I think is a very important place to start. And Dr. Crumpton, I heard you in your sort of way in which people selectively looked at Alice Walker's work and just left her behind. It's this tension between being and the body as a theological sort of a set of categories, and how do you think through that as a way to engage what I think Dr. Crumpton is rightly calling the struggle against heteropatriarchy? where would be a good starting point? Is it, and I'm referring really now to this very marginal, this mostly oppressed human body, the trans Black queer woman.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is being strategically a place to start, or would be the body a sort of a good reflecting point to start on strategically?
I mean, you've set it up with a dichotomy that I somewhat resist.
Yes.
You know.
And the resistance is where the fruitful work is going to come out. So you don't have to choose one or the other. Yeah, go for it.
yeah. I don't know that I want to, as a good queer person, I don't know that I want to embrace this kind of dichotomy, or as the, other folks would say, this kind of binary notion of a difference between beingness and embodiment. I don't know that I want to do that, particularly as I think all across the expanse of our community. In some ways, I think that is the lens by which maybe even the lens by which is not helpful for us, okay? One's being is because of one's embodiment. You see what I'm saying? And one cannot detach one thing from the other. I think in terms of also being Black, and how the other, or how white supremacists may see me. They see me in my embodiment, okay? Even as I be Black, as I move about the world in my Blackness. And even those who would like not to move about the world in their Blackness, We have some who have tried not to do that, who have dismissed this notion of Black, and who say, I'm just a person. And all on national TV, on national television, for all the world to see, to dismiss themselves as a member of a group that white supremacists don't give a damn about. And it's not fruitful. It turns out not to be fruitful for them. You understand where I'm coming from. Wish I could unpack it more, because I feel like I'm certainly not fully articulating where I want to end with this kind of logic.
Oh, I certainly get you. One of the reasons why I'm doing this, the juxtaposition that I'm doing, is precisely to get to some of the theological and religious discourses that disembody people, because it's the soul that's so important. It's the soul that's worth saving, and the way in which bodies can become so easily discounted within religious discourses. But I jumped ahead of Dr. Crumpton's brilliance.
I was listening to what you were saying. I was thinking, yeah, I feel like the question is, how free do you want to be? How free do you want to be? And what is your fear about becoming free? And what name the risk? Right? And what are you afraid of losing? And who is posing a risk? Who or what are posing a risk? First of all, part of the work is around identification. Identifying the ways in which you are bound in mind, body, and spirit. And then identifying the sources of that bondage. And then the ways in which those mechanisms continue to hold you away from fully becoming. And full becoming is about breath has a place to go in this body. And when we think about this, I would identify a false disconnect between body and spirit. Breath, also known in the biblical text, is as ruach, as the spirit of God. So where are we headed with breath that is the essence of God's presence on this earth without these bodies, right? So let's just do the theological work right there to unite. Like, let's just go, which means then we also got to do some other work, right, around original sin. And we got to do some work around what you're doing with the cross. And you got to do there's some work to do. And this is what we're in seminary for. But at the end of the day, as you're grappling with those pieces around what is your theology of the cross, what is your theology of the incarnation, she or he that the Son has set free is free indeed. So if you're going to be free, what does that look like? And more importantly, what does it feel like? You can't feel freedom without it being in your body, right? And so what do you want? What do you want, right? Nobody wants to just have a free mind, but a stuck body. That's incarceration, right? And nobody wants to have a free body, but can't think for themselves. Right. And so what is the risk? Right. And I can speak personally, like I had to make some decisions about what this thing was going to mean for me to be womanist. Right. And Pamela and I were talking earlier, and I said, I remember I was in my first or second year of seminary at ITC, and I was interning in the Office of Black Women in Church and Society in Dr. Jacqueline's office. And Reverend Joan Harrell was there. And I used to walk in that office all the time and look at those women and say, there's something wrong with you all. Y'all are too deep. It's not that serious, blah, 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 blah. And I would be afraid of them. And I'd be like underneath my breath talking about them and blah, blah. And what it really was that I was afraid of the deep war they were raging on patriarchy. And I was afraid because that meant if I started walking into that, then I was going to be one who was deeply committed to detangling myself from patriarchy, which then meant, was I going to have a husband? Or is any man going to like me? So now we got to deal with patriarchy and its interconnection with sexism, which then results in a serious homophobia and transphobia. And so then that looks like, am I going to have a husband? But furthermore, if I take this all the way into the rest of my life and I'm in church, am I even going to have a community? They're going to put me out. They're going to label me one of the lesbians, right? Which is essentially homophobic, right? And so you have to make some decisions about what freedom is going to mean for you, and trust that God is going to supply a community that is committed to freedom so that you can shake all that mess off and not be afraid of the tools of patriarchy, primary of which is alienation and isolation and dehumanization.
Can I just
Sure. Go right ahead.
Can I just hold something right here? Because it is my work as a theologian to kind of turn things on its head and problematize a little bit. Just because, yes, to everything that we've said, I'm thoroughly enjoying this, but there is a part of me that remembers a little piece of Michel Foucault's great work, The History of Sexuality. And in Foucault's work, Foucault is talking about the will to knowledge, okay? And the will to knowledge as a kind of the will to knowledge as a kind of tactic of power, okay? And as a tactic of power, he begins this discourse about the confession, okay? And the confession itself as a power move on the part of the church and a tactic of power, okay? So one day as I was reading this thing, it came upon me, and I asked my students, we were in a seminar, I said, you know, it could be that we might think about this urgency in our nation for queer people to all come out the closet as a kind of will to knowledge. You get where I'm coming from? Mm-hmm. And what does that say? Is it possible? Is it possible for the queer person to reserve their privacy? And I say, yes, it is, okay? To reserve their, and not only possible, but at times quite necessary. Foucault reserved his privacy. Mm-hmm. At times quite necessary to reserve your privacy for the sake of safety and still be free. yes, yes, and yes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yes, yes, and yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and also, I don't like, so this whole thing of if you are LGBTQ, then you have to confess it.
Oh,
right?
We have some within the queer community, Stephanie, Dr. Crumpton, that I will tell you without blinking that there, I don't know a month where I don't read some commentary by some queer person where they are critiquing someone because they're not out, or saying, well, you knew this person, they should have been out a long time ago. Or people come out at their liberty. They make their steps to being who they are as they can, and people have the right to identify themselves. We do not have the right to out anyone. Okay, that's been a long conversation in the LGBTQ community. And the reason it's been a long conversation in the LGBTQ community is because some people think that the community will be made better if we just get free. If freedom means everybody comes out, that's nothing could be farther from the truth.
Yeah. Because, I mean, and of course, there are these problematics with the coming out narratives and the way it normalizes heterosexism, because there's no requisite demand for straight people to declare I am straight. It's just assume that you are. Sorry, Dr. Crumpton. I seem to be hearing you.
Can we hear Dr. Crumpton?
Yeah, please go ahead. I seem to have been missing.
I was concerned that confession seemed oftentimes be associated with guilt. And so I don't want anybody confessing their sexuality.
True.
You see what I'm saying? There's like you confess to a crime.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm like, and in church service, you confess your sin.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want nobody else confessing, their being. Right. I don't want anybody to have to confess this detail that is a part of their beingness.
But that there are conservative church spaces, okay, in Black and brown communities where being LGBTQ could get you stood up in front of the church with the demands that you make such a confession. You know that.
Yeah. Well, here's a question from one of our attendees on a related church issue. So what would either of you propose as priorities to dismantle the ties that keep the Black church bound in heteropatriarchy? If the Black church has the greater work to engage, how do we get started or continue the work? So the question is about what are the priorities to kind of move the Black church to untangle itself, as you put it, as Dr. Crumpton, from its bondage to heteropatriarchy?
Step one is for us to believe that we can chew gum and walk at the same time, right? We can work on racism, classism, sexism, heteronormativity, transphobia. We can work on any and all forms of oppression at the same time. And to believe that we can't is to force some people who identify more than one of those categories to split themselves off. And if the goal is for us to have whole people who create whole communities, we can't keep trying to prioritize. So I got a little nervous when I saw the word prioritize. It made me think that we have to choose one above the other, right? But if you are, so maybe the first step is for us to think about what does it mean to think intersectionally when we think about our theology and our justice agendas, so that we're not cutting up people into small pieces, which is the work of oppression, which is to cut up people into small pieces. So the first step is to adopt a commitment to intersectionality, right? And we have to, there's inner work and then there's advocacy at the external work. We're gonna have to, I'm gonna use the word, we're gonna have to engage in some confession and metanoia turning around. You have to be able to say, I am homophobic, right? I am sexist. I am transphobic. I got to work on, deal with, I find myself attracted to, but I don't, you got to deal with that stuff, right? And so part of it is intersectionality and also honesty, right? Moving from what we call in the yoga world, from judgment to observation. Let's just see what it is. Let's not judge it. Let's see what it is. So now we can work on it, right? And then bring those selves, that commitment to ongoing work, to the work of justice work, I think is a good place to start.
For me, I think perhaps a good place to start would be for Black, brown, Asian, and Native American churches to untangle themselves from the myth of whiteness. Because the myth of whiteness has us ever striving to be like what we are not, and to constantly compare ourselves and to make ourselves subordinate in ways that we are not. And here's the real gimme here. The myth of whiteness has always, in the case of the Black church, in the case of Black people, has never, ever been willing to accept the humanity of Black people. This is the myth of whiteness, you know? The myth of whiteness holds itself as human, and Black people as mere animals, brutes, if you will. And if that is the case, if that is the case, and we are not able to cleanse ourselves, to remove from our parishes, our congregations, the myth of whiteness, the iconography of whiteness, the ideals of whiteness, then how will we ever reach the point where we rid ourselves of internalized oppression, see ourselves as human beings? If we do not see ourselves as human beings, we will always skate around the matters related to our sexuality. Sex in our congregations, to talk about sex in healthy ways, is difficult for us because we have been so oppressed as a people in terms of our own sexuality. Our men were considered oversexed. Our women were raped and abused. And until we rid ourselves of the myth of whiteness, we cannot have healthy conversations, truly healthy conversations that relate to sexual expression, sexual identity, queerness, womanist. We got to move from those points.
And I want to sort of underscore what you're saying, that's in the church, and you're not talking generally and broadly, so that our listeners understand that your passion here is about the church. So here's another question from one of our attendees, and I'm trying to sort of reframe it a bit about whether you can talk about the distinctions defining the LGBTQ plus community. And I think there is, in some ways, going to your point, Dr. Lightsey, about some of the work that needs to be done around education, because there can easily be a sense in which we think, oh, wow, I am not queer, therefore I am straight, because I could fall in the box of sort of a normative masculinity, normative femininity. And I think there's a lot of work that is showing, no, not so fast. Not so fast. So can you help some of our listeners understand how this may work or may not work, from the distinctions or the definitions, if at all we should be using that language?
Yeah, whiteness always makes us want to stratify ourselves, doesn't it? So again, let's dismiss this kind of whiteness. It makes us want to stratify ourselves, and let's start at the point at which we are human beings. If we are human beings, okay, if we are all human beings, if we can start from that point and accept that point And then if we can accept the point that as human beings, God created us all as unique. We're all unique individuals. Therefore, Dr. Crumpton is a couple of inches taller than I am. She's human being, I'm human being. Okay? The fact that she's a couple of inches taller than I am, that distinction should not make me subordinate to her. Okay? Should not make me any less than. I am human, she is human. What that distinction should do is help us to appreciate one another, okay? And the ways that we move about in this world, given our differences. There are things that I can do with my differences that Dr. Crumpton cannot do with her differences. And yet we're human beings. And yet we both love, we both have the same needs as human beings. We have the need to, especially in this pandemic, we have the need to relate to one another, to other human beings. We have the need for interaction. We have the need to refresh our bodies. So the distinctions are not exclusions to the source of it, to the sense that we're all humans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dr. Crumpton, you're nodding vigorously.
I am, and I'm taking notes. I'm not even gonna lie. It was so good. I was so struck by she said there are things I can do. I was writing to myself. So I wrote, there are things I can do with my differences that she cannot do with her differences, right? And that was just so powerful because there's a way in which the subtext around difference is that it's deficient or there's something aberrant, but it's not, right? And there's I was taking notes.
Right. And there is that expansive space within the Alice Walker's work about love, sexually and non-sexually, and again, we ought not to read that as a binary, but that there is this big spectrum in terms of how people express relationships with one another.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was reading an article yesterday. They were exploring this thing about sex and how long is the average sexual encounter. And they said that maybe 28 minutes, you know. And somebody else in the article said, oh no, not 28 minutes. And it was for me, it was quite a funny article. Had nothing to do with the sexual identity, how anyone identifies themselves. But the critical element here had to do with the time of lovemaking,
right? And
the goal being the climax, okay? And how, between start to, I guess one would say, climax there. But everybody on this call, on this Zoom call, everybody, we're all human beings, okay? So we're talking about the distinction there. And not a one of us probably would say, everybody here needs to be able to hold out for 28 minutes. Otherwise, you're not human. You get where I'm coming from?
Yes, yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Right. I mean, and it's so fascinating the way in which, again, this is your argument about the deeper conversations around sexuality, because there's a lot of demystification and re-education that we need to do in terms of how do people express their sexuality and how is that practiced and in sort of the ways, because again, if we keep just simply tying it to genital contact, then it's a distortion of what's going on. But anyway, you've seen some of those. I find them fairly problematic definitions of the way in these statements that churches bring out about sexuality, about God creating us for this. Some of it is just too syrupy for me, and doesn't say anything, doesn't help people understand it, and so on. But anyway, here is this question, and I think this may be the last one we have the time for, relating to the predominance, right? The pre-existing notion of queerness within indigenous and African African cultures. And so the question is asking, is to be queer also a way of challenging whiteness? I know there's some histories that the question is skipping over or that it's assuming. So how would you, what's your response to this idea that to embrace a sort of a queer disposition is in some ways to challenge white supremacy?
You do know that white supremacy exists within queer communities. I just want to put that out there,
Right.
And so I have spent quite a bit of my time as a queer womanist challenging racism within the LGBTQ community. I cannot say that the LGBTQ community in toto challenges white supremacy because it's filled with racism. And people, to be honest with you, some people within the LGBTQ community hold on to their concept of race as though it is, as a kind of a source of comfort for them, and because at least they're not Black. They may be poor, white, trash, gay, but at least they're not Black. You feel where I'm coming from? Mm-hmm. And I say these things based upon things that I've read, comments that I've read. It is horrible. So the work, I think the work is to eradicate racism. And to eradicate racism means to get at white supremacy. Mm-hmm. That's the work. Doesn't mean that everybody's doing the work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dr. Crumpton?
Yeah, I was listening and also making quite a few faces, and I figured out why I was making faces. And part of it is that so I'm gonna backtrack and say a couple weeks last week I was having a conversation. You and I were talking, Steed Davidson, about a conversation in which someone had decided that Blackness is essentially about struggle. Yep. That to be Black,
right,
the primary point of departure and understanding Black existence is to start with struggle. And so I was making faces because I started questioning whether or not there is an articulation, an embodiment, and living into queerness that does not start by centering whiteness as something to oppose. I would be very concerned for any group that wants to name itself and identify its primary motivation for existing as existing in opposition or existing to refute or existing to prove wrong, because that's a sort of negative existence, right? You build yourself on who you are based on who you are not, which is really what white supremacy does, right? It gains a sense of who it is by misnaming others and by misnaming them, right? As non-human or less human, they gain a better sense, white supremacists, not all white folk, but white supremacists gain a better sense of their humanity. So I don't want us to get into, and I have to say, I feel like I'm a guest in some parts of this conversation around the use of the word queer, right? But like, I would hope that the question that was asked, I'm hoping that there's attention to, if you are going to self-identify and name yourself as queer, do so out of the richness of who you are and are becoming, not who you had to be and who you are recovering from, which is to still center whiteness as the arbiter of one's identity. I don't want white supremacy to be the start point for me saying who I am.
Yeah.
It can be an outcome as I live my life. People say, oh, she ain't that, or he ain't that, or they ain't that. But I don't want for people to say of me, nor of sorry about that, nor of for me to say to myself that all of my life is about struggling about being who they said I'm not.
Yeah.
Like that's a waste of God's energy. It's necessary recovery work, but I don't want that when we say the work is done or when we meet a benchmark, I can finally say that I'm not them. I don't want that to be the goal. I can finally say, and then there has to be a creation of new language to identify who you are. New language that hasn't been invaded and embedded with white supremacist commitments to denigration, right? So I think that's my response. I don't want anybody to start naming themselves in contradiction to whiteness.
Because you would have been involved in this distraction. You would have lived your life in this distraction.
There it is.
Toni Morrison is,
there
that's
it is.
why that quote is so poignant for me.
There it is.
Yeah. Well, and of course, the distraction, and this is what you're saying to Dr. Crumpton, the distraction keeps white supremacy as not just as the default, but the central topic of the agenda. It's always, in some ways, this thing you're fighting against. And sadly, it is one of the places within the last few months or years, or however we want to start it, where we see a lot of intellectual work going, where it's this production of knowledge, but it is in some ways just recirculating the issues that white supremacy has been throwing up, and keeping it there, rather than saying, you know what, let's there are other things worth exploring. There are other conversations that are necessary for our survival. So there's some big takeaways as we come to the end of this that I want to repeat. Certainly some of the things that I heard from you, Dr. Lightsey, this solid idea of Blackness as a kind of queerness that's dangerous, risky, taboo, different, and the fundamental commitment that Blackness has to be in solidarity with queerness, the clear sense of overlap, and so on. And Dr. Crumpton, your emphasis on survival and wholeness, and the thrust to becoming whole people, the fight against heteropatriarchy as important, and the disentangling from that, and the internalization of those oppressions that you have. But importantly, as you frame this conversation and in some ways the genesis of what brings us here, to note marginalization within Black margins. This tendency, certainly within the Black church, of replicating these processes of marginalization when it comes to queer folk that have already been learned somewhere else, and doing it with us who are already on the margins. These were very powerful insights that both of you shared. I think I speak on behalf of those who participated today, those who will watch the recording at a later date, that we are deeply appreciative of the work that you have done for us today and the work that you will continue to do in your own spaces. Two fundamentally powerful women who are doing work in theological education. I deeply appreciate you, my sisters, and the work that you do. Thank you for showing up here, and continue the struggle.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Dr. Lightsey.
Very good to be with you, Dr. Crumpton.
Well, thank you. And those who participated, thank you for viewing and tuning in. And that's it. We're at an end.